The observation gallery surrounding the decompression chamber was packed with students and faculty from every program in the academy, and Kira could feel their eyes on her as she stepped through the airlock. The chamber itself was a massive cylindrical space designed to simulate the worst conditions a spacefaring engineer might face. Hull breaches could be triggered at random points along the curved walls. The temperature could drop to near absolute zero within seconds. The atmosphere could be vented completely, leaving nothing but the cold vacuum of space. Kira wore a standard emergency suit that would give her exactly 15 minutes of air if everything went wrong. And she carried a kit of basic repair tools that rattled against her hip as she walked to the center of the chamber. Through the thick observation windows, she could see Valith in the front row, his mandibles spread wide in what passed for smile. Among the Voluntari behind him sat Instructor Corvith with his forearms folded across his chest and his compound eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. Celia and Torvin were there too, pressed against the back wall of the gallery, and their presence gave Kira a small measure of comfort. She was not truly alone even if she had to face this test by herself. The warning klaxon sounded 3 times, and then the chamber came alive with simulated disaster. The first breach opened on her left, a howling wound in the metal that began venting atmosphere with a scream like dying animals. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on her visor. Within seconds, Kira moved. She did not panic, and she did not hesitate, and she did not waste a single precious second on fear. Her hands found the repair foam in her kit, and she sprinted toward the breach, fighting against the pull of escaping air that tried to drag her off her feet. The foam sealed the first hole just as a second breach opened behind her, and then a third, and then a fourth. The test was supposed to present 1 breach at a time with recovery periods between each challenge. But someone had clearly modified the parameters. They were trying to overwhelm her. They were trying to make her fail in front of everyone. Kira felt something cold and calm settle over her mind like a blanket of fresh snow. This was what humans did. This was what they had evolved to do when the world tried to kill them. They did not give up, and they did not surrender. They thought their way through the chaos, and they kept moving until the job was done or they were dead. She sealed the second breach, and the third, and the fourth, her hands moving with mechanical precision while her mind tracked the shifting patterns of failure around her. Her breathing stayed slow and measured even as her oxygen supply ticked downward. Her voice remained steady as she talked herself through each step, a running commentary that her suit microphone broadcast to the observation gallery. Breach at 40 degrees, 6 meters high, structural foam required, temperature dropping but within tolerance, moving to intercept. The audience watched in stunned silence. This was not what they had expected. They had expected screaming and panic and a desperate flailing of a primitive creature out of its depth. Instead, they witnessed something that many of them had never seen before. They witnessed a human being performing under pressure that would have shattered most species. The Voluntari had evolved to freeze when threatened, their exoskeletons locking into defensive positions while they waited for danger to pass. The Keth had evolved to flee, their bioluminescence dimming as they sought dark corners where predators could not follow. Even the Dreth, for all their warrior culture, relied on overwhelming force rather than calm precision. But humans had evolved differently. Humans had learned to think clearly when death was breathing down their necks. Adrenaline sharpened their focus. Instead of scattering it, fear became fuel instead of paralysis. Kira sealed the final breach with 30 seconds of air remaining in her tank, and the chamber fell silent as the simulation ended. But she did not move toward the exit. Something had caught her attention during her frantic circuit of the chamber walls, a microfracture in the structural integrity of the observation window, not part of the simulation, real damage that had been hidden beneath a thin layer of cosmetic plating. If another student had taken this test and triggered the wrong vibration frequency, that window would have shattered and vented the entire observation gallery into space. Kira walked to the window and pointed at the fracture, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber speakers. There is damage here that is not part of the test. This is a real structural failure that needs immediate attention. The silence in the observation gallery shifted from them. Impressed to horrified technical officers scrambled to verify her claim while students pressed back from the windows they had been leaning against just moments before. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. The fracture was real. It had been created recently. Someone had sabotaged the chamber in a way that would have killed not just the test subject, but potentially dozens of observers. Suspicion fell immediately on Valith and his circle. Though no direct evidence could be found, the Academy was forced to acknowledge publicly that a murder attempt had been made. And for the first time, the administration could not simply sweep the incident under the rug. Kira became something new in the eyes of her fellow students. She became someone who had faced death and walked away smiling. She became someone who had saved lives that her tormentors had been willing to sacrifice. She became dangerous in the days that followed. Students began approaching her in quiet moments. A Valanthari Jr. who had been targeted for having the wrong family connections. A Dreth who had been passed over for advancement despite perfect scores. A Keth whose research had been stolen by a senior student and published under another name. They told her their stories, and she listened, and she added each account to the growing database of evidence that she and Celia had been building. Torvin found her in the archives one evening after a particularly long day of whispered confessions. "You are building something," he said in his slow, grinding voice. "Something that could bring down the whole rotten structure of this place." Kira looked up at him with eyes that held no warmth and no mercy. "Yes," she replied simply. "I am." "Good," Torvin rumbled, and something that might have been a smile crossed his stony features. "Tell me how I can help." Before Kira could respond, a message arrived on her terminal. It was a summons to Instructor Corvith's office. "You have made yourself an inconvenience." The message read, "Report immediately so we can discuss how to handle inconveniences that refuse to go away quietly." Kira read the words 3 times and then stood up from her chair. "It is time," she said to Torvin. "One way or another, this ends now." The transport ship docked with a metallic groan that echoed through the empty hangar bay, and Kira Vasquez stepped onto the Valanthari Grand Academy station for the first time in her life. She had expected a welcome committee, or at least a sign pointing her toward registration. But the hangar was cold and silent and completely abandoned. Her breath fogged in the frigid air as she pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders and wondered if perhaps she had arrived at the wrong entrance. The Academy orbited a dying red star, and its ancient halls had trained the greatest minds of 12 star systems for over 3,000 years. Humanity had only joined the Galactic Compact 18 months ago, and Kira was the first of her kind to ever set foot in this place. She was not supposed to be here. The acceptance letter had made that abundantly clear through its cold and formal language, stating that her admission was a diplomatic gesture rather than a recognition of merit. The Valanthari who ran the Academy considered humans barely more than clever animals, a young species still playing with primitive technology, while the rest of the galaxy had already mastered the stars. Kira found the registration office after wandering through identical gray corridors for nearly an hour. and the voluntary administrator barely glanced at her before assigning her to the Integration Sciences track. This was the easiest program the Academy offered, designed for species that struggled with advanced concepts. And Kira felt the insult settle into her bones like ice. Her dormitory assignment was in Sector 12, the oldest and most neglected part of the station, where the heating systems worked only half the time and the walls were stained with centuries of moisture damage. She carried her single bag through corridors that grew darker and colder with each turn, passing clusters of alien students who fell silent as she walked by. Their eyes followed her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. And she heard whispers in languages her translator could not quite catch. The room itself was barely larger than a closet, with a bed that was clearly designed for a species with a very different body shape, and a desk that wobbled dangerously when she touched it. Kira sat down on the uncomfortable mattress and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel sorry for herself before she straightened her spine and began to unpack. She had known this would be hard. She had known they would not want her here, but Kira Vasquez had not traveled 400 light years to give up on her first day. The next morning brought her first encounter with Instructor Corvith, a towering Velanthari whose forearms moved in constant, unsettling patterns as he spoke. His exoskeleton was the deep purple of old bruises, and his compound eyes reflected Kira's face back at her in 1,000 tiny fragments. He called her into his office before her first class and made her stand, while he remained seated behind his massive desk. The message was clear, without a single word being spoken. She was beneath him in every possible way. "You will fail," Corvith said finally, his mandibles clicking between each word in a sound that her translator rendered as cold amusement. "The only question is how gracefully you will accept your failure and return to your homeworld." Kira said nothing because she had learned long ago that some battles were not won with words. She simply waited until he dismissed her and then walked to her first class with her head held high. The course load waiting for her was impossible, where other students in her track had 4 classes. Kira had been assigned 8, where others had standard laboratory hours. She had been scheduled for double shifts that would leave her no time for sleep. Her equipment was outdated, and her access codes worked only intermittently, and her assigned study materials were somehow always checked out of the library before she arrived. But Kira was not alone in her suffering. On the 3rd day she met Torvin, a massive creature whose body seemed to be made of living gray stone. He moved slowly and spoke even slower, and the other students avoided him with the same wariness they showed her. She learned that he was a Dreth, from a warrior species that had been conquered by the Compact 2 centuries ago, and that his clan had sent him here as a punishment for some offense he refused to name. He sat next to her in advanced systems theory and said nothing for the entire first week. On the 5th day, she met Celia, a Keth whose translucent body glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns that shifted with her emotions. Celia was brilliant and terrified in equal measure, a scholarship student from a poor colony world who had been systematically crushed by the Academy's brutal hierarchy. She flinched whenever a senior student walked past and kept her gaze fixed permanently on the floor. The Academy operated on a simple principle that Kira came to understand. Through painful experience, power flowed downward. Senior students could demand anything from juniors, and instructors looked the other way as long as the hierarchy was maintained. The Voluntari had built this system centuries ago, and it served their purposes perfectly. It weeded out the weak and the unwanted and the different. It ensured that only those who fit the proper mold would ever rise to positions of influence. Kira watched and listened and learned, and she began to see the patterns beneath the surface. Certain Species always seemed to struggle while others sailed through. With ease, certain students received help while others were left to drown. This was not simply a difficult school. This was a machine designed to break anyone who threatened the established order, and humans, it seemed, were the newest threat. On the third night, Kira returned to her room to find her research files corrupted beyond recovery. Her equipment had been smashed against the wall. A few personal belongings were scattered across the floor, and a message glowed on her terminal screen in letters that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Go home, mammal," it read, "before we send you home in pieces." Kira stood in the center of her destroyed room and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not fear, it was not despair, it was something older and colder and far more dangerous. It was the stubbornness that had carried her ancestors across continents and oceans. It was the persistence that had driven humanity to reach for stars they had no business touching. It was the absolute refusal to stay down when someone tried to push her into the dirt. Kira cleaned up the mess and backed up what files she could recover, and went to sleep on her broken bed with a smile on her face. They wanted to break her. They had no idea what they had started. The harassment grew worse with each passing week, and Kira learned to recognize the patterns of her tormentors like a hunter tracking prey through fresh snow. Valith Corvith led the campaign against her, the instructor's own offspring who had inherited his father's purple exoskeleton and his contempt for lesser species. Valith moved through the academy like a prince surveying his kingdom, surrounded always by a circle of loyal followers who laughed at his jokes and carried out his orders without question. Kira became their favorite target. Her food was contaminated with compounds that were harmless to most species, but left humans nauseated for hours. Her access codes were mysteriously revoked at critical moments, locking her out of laboratories and study halls. Right before important deadlines, her sleep schedule was attacked through careful manipulation, with her practical exams always scheduled during the hours when human biology demanded rest. The cruelty was precise and calculated, and designed to leave no evidence. When Kira complained to the administration, she was told that she must be imagining things. When she presented proof of sabotage, she was informed that her equipment must have malfunctioned on its own. When she requested a transfer to different housing, she was denied without explanation. The message was clear: nobody was coming to save her. Nobody cared if she succeeded or failed. She was utterly alone. But Kira Vasquez had never needed anyone to save her. She adapted like water flowing around stones, finding new paths when old ones were blocked, and creating solutions where none had existed before. She learned to synthesize caffeine in the botanical laboratory, brewing the bitter compound in secret, and using it to push through the exhaustion that dragged at her bones. She discovered which maintenance corridors were never monitored and used them to move through the station unseen. She found hiding spots in the vast archive stacks where she could study without interruption. Surrounded by the musty smell of ancient data crystals, her body complained constantly. But Kira had learned long ago to ignore its protests. Celia found her one evening in the archives, slumped over a pile of research materials with dark circles under her eyes and a half-empty container of synthesized caffeine cooling beside her. The keth's bioluminescent patterns flickered with concern as she settled into the chair across from Kira. "How do you do it?" Celia asked in a whisper, her voice carrying the musical undertones of her species. "How do you keep going when they work so hard to make you fail?" Kira looked up from her notes and considered the question seriously. "Do you know how humans used to hunt?" she asked. And Celia shook her head. "We were not the fastest animals on our world. and we were not the strongest either. But we were the most stubborn. She leaned back in her chair and stretched muscles that ached from hours of sitting. Our ancestors would pick a target and then follow it across the grasslands for days at a time, never running and never stopping and never giving up until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. And then they would walk up to an animal that could have killed them easily in a fair fight and finish it off without breaking a sweat. Celia's patterns shifted to something like wonder, persistence hunting. Kira continued, "We did not outrun anything. We outlasted it, and that instinct never went away. So when someone tells me I cannot do something, my brain does not accept it as information. It accepts it as a challenge." The cat was quiet for a long moment before her glow shifted to a warmer shade. "I think I understand," Celia said softly. "You are not fighting them the way they expect you to fight." "Exactly," Kira replied with a tired smile. "They want me to get angry and make mistakes. They want me to give up or lash out or prove that humans are the emotional primitives they believe us to be. But I am not going to give them that satisfaction." She gestured at the stacks of materials around her. "Instead, I am going to pass every single exam they throw at me. And I am going to document every single act of sabotage in meticulous detail. And when the time is right, I'm going to make them choke on their own cruelty." From that night forward, Celia became her ally in truth. The cat had access to systems that Kira could not reach. And she began quietly copying records of every suspicious incident that affected the human student. They built a database together. Hidden in encrypted files that no one thought to look for. Torvin joined them 3 weeks later. The massive Dreth had been watching Kira with growing interest. And one evening in advanced systems theory, he finally spoke more than 2 words to her. "You do not break," he rumbled in a voice like grinding boulders. "I have seen many students come through this place, and most of them break within the first month. But you do not break. Is that a question or an observation?" Kira asked without looking up from her notes. "An observation," Torvin replied. "My clan sent me here to learn humility, to be crushed by superior minds until I understood my place in the universe. But watching you has taught me something different." He paused for so long that Kira finally looked up to meet his stone eyes. "I am learning humility," he continued, "but not the way they intended. I am learning that I was wrong to think that strength was only measured in the ability to destroy." The midterm assessments arrived like a storm on the horizon, and Kira prepared for them with every scrap of energy she had left. She had been given half the resources of other students and twice the obstacles. And by every reasonable calculation, she should have failed. But Kira did not believe in reasonable calculations. She walked into each exam with her spine straight and her mind clear. And she answered every question with the knowledge she had clawed from the academies. Reluctant grasp when the results were posted. She stood before the ranking board and felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not just passing top 15%. The whispers spread through the station like wildfire. And for the first time, Kira saw something other than contempt in the eyes of her fellow students. She saw uncertainty. She saw fear. Instructor Corvith summoned her to his office that same evening, and his mandibles clicked with barely contained fury. "Your performance has been noted," he said in a tone that made the words sound like a threat. "The administration has decided that your next assessment will be an applied practical examination." He leaned forward across his desk. "You will demonstrate your ability to perform emergency hull repairs in a decompression chamber under full vacuum conditions." Kira kept her expression perfectly neutral, even as her heart began to race. The decompression chamber tests were legendary at the academy. And not in a good way. Students had died in that chamber when the pressure seals failed or the temperature controls malfunctioned. It was where they sent people they wanted to disappear. "Schedule it," Kira said. And her voice did not waver. "And make sure there is an audience. I want everyone to see what a human can do." Corvith's compound eyes glittered with something that might have been surprise or might have been anticipation. "As you wish," he replied. "Try not to die too quickly. It would be disappointing after all the trouble you have caused." Kira walked out of his office with her fists clenched at her sides and a fire burning in her chest. They wanted to break her. They wanted to kill her. She was going to give them a show they would never forget. Instructor Corvith sat behind his massive desk like a spider waiting at the center of its web, and his compound eyes tracked Kira as she entered his office without waiting for permission to sit. "You have become a problem," he said without preamble. "A persistent irritation that refuses to resolve itself through natural means." Kira remained standing and kept her hands loose at her sides. "I have done nothing except survive the challenges you created for me," she replied calmly. "If that makes me a problem, then perhaps the issue lies with your expectations rather than my performance." Corvith's mandibles clicked in what her translator rendered as cold amusement. "Survival is not the same as success, and your continued presence here has created complications that I can no longer ignore." He leaned forward and his forearms spread wide in a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating. "I am formally charging you with academic fraud. Your performance in the midterm assessments was statistically impossible given your documented preparation time, and I have convened a tribunal to investigate your cheating." Kira felt the trap closing around her, but she did not let it show on her face. "A tribunal," she repeated. "Judged by whom exactly?" "By senior faculty members, of course," Corvith replied. "Under academy bylaws that have served us well for 3,000 years. He smiled again with all his mandibles. "Unfortunately, those bylaws do not permit humans to call witnesses or present evidence in their own defense. A minor oversight that was never corrected since we never expected to admit your kind." The hearing was scheduled for 1 week later, and Kira used every hour of that time to prepare. She reached out to contacts she had made throughout the academy and called in favors she had been saving for exactly this moment. Celia worked through the nights, pulling records from systems that should have been secure and copying files that powerful people thought were hidden. Torvin stood guard outside their hidden workspace, his stone body blocking the corridor while his presence discouraged curious investigators. On the day of the tribunal, Kira made a single request. She asked that the proceedings be open to the public and broadcast live to the Galactic Compact's Academic Oversight Council. Corvith agreed immediately. He saw it as a chance to humiliate humanity on a galactic stage, to prove once and for all that this upstart species had no place among civilized peoples. He had no idea what was coming. The tribunal chamber was filled to capacity with students and faculty and diplomatic observers from a dozen worlds. Holographic displays carried the feed to millions of viewers across the compact. Corvith presented his case with theatrical confidence. Statistical analyses that showed Kira's scores were implausible. Testimony from anonymous sources who claimed to have seen her cheating, procedural arguments that painted her as a troublemaker who had been given chance after chance to succeed honestly. The tribunal members nodded along with every word. Their verdict clearly decided before the first witness had been called. Then it was Kira's turn. She stood before the assembly and looked directly into the broadcast cameras and began to speak. "I am not here to defend myself against false accusations," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I am here to present evidence of a systematic campaign of harassment and abuse that has poisoned this institution for centuries." Corvith's mandibles stopped their confident clicking. "For the past 18 months, I have documented every act of sabotage committed against me," Kira continued. "Every contaminated meal, every corrupted file, every rigged exam schedule, every threatening message." She activated her personal display and began projecting files onto the chamber's main screen. "I have testimony from Celia, of the Keth who witnessed senior students destroying my equipment." Celia stepped forward from the crowd and her bioluminescent patterns blazed with fierce light as she confirmed every word. I have testimony from Torvin of the Dreth, who intercepted an assault against me in the maintenance corridors. Torvin rose to his full massive height, and his grinding voice filled the chamber as he described what he had seen. I have communication records showing Violet Corvus coordinating harassment campaigns against not just me, but dozens of other students over the past 5 years. The files scrolled across the screen, and gasps echoed through the assembly. I have maintenance logs proving that the decompression chamber was deliberately sabotaged in a way that would have killed everyone in the observation gallery. More files appeared. Technical diagrams and timestamp records and testimony from maintenance staff who had been pressured to stay silent. And I have historical records stretching back 300 years, showing a pattern of systematic abuse against any species that the Volanthari considered beneath them. The final files were the most damaging of all. Admission statistics showing that certain species were failed at impossibly high rates. Incident reports that had been buried or destroyed, correspondence between administrators discussing how to discourage undesirable students from completing their programs. The Volanthari did not build an academy, Kira said as the evidence continued to scroll past. They built a filter designed to keep power in familiar hands, and they have used that filter to crush generations of students who had every right to be here. The broadcast feeds showed viewers across the compact watching in stunned silence. The Academic Oversight Council demanded an immediate external investigation. Corvus rose from his seat with fury radiating from every joint of his exoskeleton. You have no right, he snarled. You are nothing but a primitive creature who should never have been allowed through our doors. I have every right, Kira replied without flinching. You invited me here and you tried to break me and you failed. She stepped closer to him and her voice dropped to something quiet and cold. You forgot what humans do when someone tries to break us. We do not give up and we do not surrender. We gather our strength and we wait for the right moment, and then we bring down the whole rotten structure on top of our enemies. Velith lunged at her from the crowd. His clawed hands reached for her throat and his mandibles spread wide in a killing strike that had ended disputes among his species for thousands of years. He never reached her. Torvin intercepted the blow with one massive stone arm, and the crack of chitin against mineral rang through the chamber like a gunshot. Velith staggered backward with his right arm hanging useless at his side. Security forces rushed forward to restrain him, and Kira stood untouched in the center of the chaos with the evidence of centuries of abuse still scrolling across the screens behind her. The tribunal was over. The real reckoning had just begun. The chaos following Vela's attack took nearly an hour to settle, and when the security forces finally cleared the tribunal chamber, Kira found herself standing in a pool of her own blood. One of Vela's claws had caught her arm during his lunge, leaving a shallow gash that painted crimson streaks down her sleeve. She had not even noticed the wound until a medical officer pointed it out. Torvin stood beside her with chips of purple chitin still embedded in his stone knuckles, and Celia hovered nearby with her patterns cycling through colors that had no translation in any language. Kira knew the broadcast was still running. Millions of viewers across the compact watched as the human student pressed a simple bandage against her wound and turned to face the tribunal one final time. Let the record show, Kira said in a voice that carried no pain and no triumph. What happens when they cannot win through legitimate means? She gestured at the blood on the floor and then at the evidence still frozen on the display screens. This is what they do. This is who they are. And this is why the Academy needs to change. The external investigation began within the hour. Investigators from the Compact's Oversight Council arrived on emergency transport and immediately sealed all administrative records. Instructor Corvus was removed from his position before the day was over, escorted from his office by security officers who had once answered to him without question. Valeth faced criminal charges for assault with intent to kill, and his diplomatic immunity was revoked after the Compact Council determined that his actions had violated half a dozen interstellar treaties. A third of the senior administrative staff resigned rather than face scrutiny, their departures creating vacancies that would take months to fill. Some of them fled the station entirely, booking passage on the first ships they could find and disappearing into the vastness of space. But the investigation did not stop with the obvious criminals. It dug deeper into the Academy's history and uncovered centuries of buried misconduct. It found evidence of students who had died under suspicious circumstances and families who had been paid to remain silent. It found records of entire species being systematically excluded from advanced programs. It found a rot so deep and so old that many wondered if anything could be salvaged at all. Kira watched it all unfold from her hospital bed where the medical staff had insisted she rest while her wound healed. She received visitors at all hours of the day and night. Students she had never spoken to came to thank her for giving them hope. Faculty members who had been afraid to speak out for decades came to offer their support. Diplomatic representatives came to discuss what humanity's role might be in reshaping the institution that had tried so hard to destroy her. One visitor stood out from all the others, an ancient Velantari whose exoskeleton had faded to pale gray. With age shuffled into her room on the third day of her recovery, he was the oldest member of the Academy's founding council, a survivor from an era when the institution had actually stood for the ideals it claimed to represent. "I owe you an apology," he said in a voice that crackled like dry leaves. "Not just for what was done to you, but for what was done in my name." While I looked the other way, Kira studied him for a long moment before responding. "Apologies are easy," she said finally. "What matters is what happens next." The old Valentari nodded slowly. "The Council has voted to implement comprehensive reforms under external oversight. We will rewrite the Academy Charter to prevent this kind of abuse from ever happening again. And we want you to help us do it." Kira was offered a position on the newly created Student Advocacy Council, a body that would have real power to investigate complaints and protect vulnerable students. She accepted on one condition: Torvin and Celia would serve alongside her. The reforms took months to implement, and the resistance from entrenched interests was fierce at every step. But the evidence Kira had gathered was too damning to ignore, and the public attention was too intense to allow business as usual. The hierarchy that had crushed generations of students was dismantled piece by piece. New policies were enacted, new oversight mechanisms were established, new paths were opened for students who had been told they would never belong. 1 year after the tribunal that changed everything, Kira stood in the main hangar bay and watched a new cohort of students arrive. Among them were 3 more humans, their applications processed fairly and their admissions based on merit. One of them spotted Kira as he stepped off the transport. He was young and nervous, with wide eyes that had not yet learned to hide their wonder. "You are her," he said in a voice that trembled slightly. "You are Kira Vasquez, the one who—" "I am just a student," Kira interrupted gently. "Same as you?" She stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "This place tried to tell us we did not belong, and we proved them wrong. Now it is your turn to prove what you are capable of." The young man straightened his spine and squared his shoulders. "I will not let you down," he said. Kira smiled and shook her head. "Do not do it for me. Do it for yourself. Do it because you have every right to be here, and no one gets to tell you otherwise." She stepped back and gestured toward the corridor that led into the Academy proper. "Now go. Find your quarters and get some rest. Classes start tomorrow and—" "They do not wait for anyone." The young human walked past her with determination in his steps, and behind him came more students from a dozen different worlds. Some of them would struggle, and some of them would thrive, and some of them would find their paths blocked by obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But they would not face those obstacles alone. They would not be broken by a system designed to crush them. They would have advocates and allies, and evidence of what was possible when someone refused to give up. Torvin appeared at Kira's side as the last of the new arrivals disappeared into the station. "You have changed this place," he rumbled in his slow, grinding voice. "Changed it in ways that will outlast all of us." Kira watched the empty hangar for a moment before turning to walk toward the study halls that had once locked her out. "I did not do it alone," she said. "None of this would have been possible without you and Celia and all the others who were brave enough to speak up." Celia joined them at the quarter junction, her bioluminescent patterns glowing with warm, steady light. "What now?" she asked Kira. Considered the question as they walked together through halls that no longer felt hostile. "Now we keep going," she said finally. "We make sure the changes stick, and we help the students who come after us, and we prove every single day that they were wrong about us." She paused at the entrance to the main library and looked back at her friends. "They tried to break us, and they failed. And the academy was never the same. But that is not the end of the story." Her smile held a warmth and determination that had carried her through 18 months of calculated cruelty. "That is just the beginning." And together they walked forward into a future they had built with their own hands, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations of students who had been told they would never belong. The academy had tried to break the human student. Instead, she had broken its chains.